Good afternoon. This afternoon I want to take a look at a couple of different techniques in Photoshop that will allow you to have greater control over some of the adjustments that you are making. So let's get at it. First of all, I want to take a look at the difference between opacity and flow. This applies primarily when you're using the brush tool, but also can apply to some other tools such as the clone stamp. And secondly, I want to take a look at refining adjustments using the Blend If slider. So let's jump into taking a look, first of all, at the opacity versus flow controls on your brush or various other tools, primarily the clone stamp. I've got my brush selected here, and I've set the opacity and flow at 100%. Of course, this is where you find the controls up the top of your screen. And if I just pick a hard edge brush just to demonstrate here, at 100% opacity, 100% flow, and I've picked color red just so it's quite visible. If I paint on my canvas, you'll see it lays down a nice dark red strip. If I hold my cursor button down and lay down that strip and then go back and forth over top of it, it doesn't get any darker. If I paint on areas that I haven't painted on before, of course it lays down the color there, but it lays it down as a solid color at a set opacity or intensity. If I reduce the opacity, let's say to around 50%, and hold the mouse button down and paint a strip, of course it lays down a lighter version of that red. And if I keep my mouse button down and go back and forth on that strip, you'll notice it doesn't get any darker. Of course, if I paint on new areas, it lays down that color, but with the same intensity. So I can go back and forth as many times as I want. It doesn't get any darker. If I release the mouse button and then paint again, holding the mouse button down, it lays down another layer on top, which kind of darkens up the layer below. But if I'm painting on a new area, it lays down that, in this case, 55% opacity color. You can kind of think of it as a stack of colored or dark, slightly darkened pieces of glass. Each piece that you lay on top of the one below it increasingly darkens the view through the glass, but it's the same darkness throughout wherever those pieces of glass overlap. If I drop this to 20%, same thing. Holding the mouse button down, it lays down that color at about 20% opacity, but it doesn't get any darker the more, regardless how many times I paint back and forth. Release the button and then press it again and start painting. Of course, same thing. It adds another layer which darkens any layer that it's overlapping, and so on. So I can keep, pressing and releasing the mouse button and painting new layers, and eventually wherever it's overlapping will get darker. But with each pass, each time I'm holding the mouse button down, it's still just laying down that one intensity of color, if you want to call it that, or opacity. Let's contrast that to flow. So I'll go back to 100% opacity, 100% flow, and of course paint a line, same thing as before when I had the opacity and flow both at 100%. But let's drop the flow to 50% or thereabouts. And I hold the mouse button down, and as I paint, as you might expect, it's not quite as bright or intense as the line above it. But this time, if I keep the mouse button down and start painting back and forth, it gets darker and darker wherever I'm overlapping. It's perhaps going to be a little easier if I go down to, say, around 10%, 14%. Now you can see it's much lighter. But as I keep the mouse button down and start painting back and forth, it keeps getting darker and darker wherever it's overlapping. If I go down to around 5%, you can really see how by holding the mouse button down, I can really start to control where it gets dark and where I want to lay down a light patch. So you can kind of think of it as coloring with a crayon using a relatively light touch. The more you rub the crayon back and forth over the same spot, the darker and darker it's going to get. So some will say, well, yeah, for dodging and burning, for example, I just use opacity. I don't need to use flow. I can do the same thing with opacity. And to a certain extent, that's true. If I set my opacity down, okay, let's go down to 4%. My flow's at 100%. I'm just going to do a new layer here just to keep things a little cleaner. I can, as before, lay down a layer that's 4% opacity, release the mouse button, click again, and keep clicking, unclicking, and eventually I'll build up that darker and darker color wherever it overlaps. But the big difference is this is still like layering those pieces of darkened glass. Each layer that you apply applies that same intensity over the everything below it. You can't really say, well, in this corner of the glass I want it a little bit darker, and in the other corner I want it a little bit lighter. It's going to be the same throughout every time you make a pass with the mouse. So yes, you can build it up, but using flow, you can have much more control over, every time you paint back and forth, it gets darker and darker. You can paint back and forth on one area and move to a different area, and you have the control over just how much you want to darken one area versus another. Let's look at a slightly different combination where now we'll use both opacity and flow in combination with each other. And I'll set the opacity, say 3%, the opacity at roughly 40%, the flow at 3%, and start painting. And of course, as I paint back and forth over the same area, it gets darker and darker. But notice that it gets to a point where no matter how much I paint over the same area, it doesn't get any darker or any more intense. That's because opacity is set at 42%. So no matter how much time or how much I paint back and forth, it's never going to exceed an overall opacity of 42%. So that kind of provides the upper limit or control so that you don't get too dark, as in the case up here where I had the opacity at 100%. Painted a couple times, and I would essentially be at 100% with the whole paint job. Of course, if I release the mouse and then start painting again, it will darken the areas of overlap. but it still won't add any more than another 40%. So that 40%, it's kind of like governor on a car. It only allows you to go so fast. Here, using a very low flow, it's very light to begin with. You can keep darkening it more and more, but you've set an upper limit, so it will never get any darker than that upper limit unless you release the mouse and then paint again. So that's kind of the difference between opacity and flow. And particularly using them together, you can really have a lot of control as you paint back and forth with the mouse. And without having to keep releasing the mouse button and lay down another, set amount, you've got the control over exactly how much paint you're applying to any particular area. So yes, you can use low opacity when dodging and burning or in other applications, but particularly using opacity in conjunction with the low flow, you really have a high degree of control over your dodging and burning or painting in a mask on an adjustment layer. So hopefully that gives you a better feel for the difference between opacity and flow. Now let's take a look at how I use blend if sliders that some of you might be familiar with to control where a particular adjustment is being applied. So I have a gradient here that's going from not quite black, but very dark gray to not complete white, but a very light highlight and kind of everything in between. So this first layer, I've actually set up a curves adjustment layer and pulled the curve down a little bit to darken the image. I'm just going to get rid of that. So I've masked this so that that curves adjustment is only applying to the top part of the gradient. I've masked it. You can see the mask here. I've masked it so it's not applying to the bottom part. So if I turn it on and off, you can obviously see that the top part of the image is being darkened by that curves adjustment layer. But notice that the parts of the gradient that were dark gray have now gone to pretty much black, which you would expect if you darken it. And the highlights have, they've obviously gotten a little bit darker, but also taken on a bit of a gray tinge. And this can certainly sometimes happen when you are darkening highlights. They almost start to look a little bit gray or muddy, and that's kind of why that effect is happening. You're darkening it, which is essentially moving it more into the gray tones. Sometimes when you apply adjustment, you obviously don't want the darker parts of your image to go black, because then you pretty much lose detail in those areas. And you may or may not want to, similarly, may or may not want to darken the highlights. So how can you control that? Certainly, for those familiar with luminosity masks, that's one option. But a very easy option that's available in Photoshop without any particular plugins or anything else, it's part of Photoshop, is the blend if slider. So if you double click on the layer, being careful not to, if you double click on the layer name, of course, you're going to be able to change the layer name. So that's not where you want to click. You want to click, sort of on the edge of the layer, double click it, and it brings up this layer style dialog box. And what we're interested in is the blending options, and particularly the lower bar of these two. The upper one says this layer, the other one says underlying layer. And it's this underlying layer that we want to adjust, or we want to use the sliders on this bar. So what this bar is saying is that for my adjustment layer, I want to apply it to these tones. So of course these sliders are at opposite or extreme ends of the slider. So in essence, you're saying I want to apply my adjustment to essentially the entire range of tones within the underlying layer. But notice what happens if I start to move one of these sliders. I'll move the dark one and watch the upper part of the screen here. As I move that, you see it starts to, you start getting a very solid dividing line. So what it's saying is apply the adjustment, in this case curves adjustment, apply that to everything, every tone in the image below, except anything that's any darker than this point. Don't apply it to there. So in the actual image, it's saying, if I move this out of the way, it's saying apply that adjustment to every part of the underlying layer except anything darker than this tone here. So, and you're controlling that by this slider here. So I can pick whatever, however shade of darkness, if you want to call it that, I want to exclude from that adjustment by moving that slider back and forth. So if I only want to apply it to, or if I don't want to apply it to, the very, very darkest parts of the image, then, I keep the adjuster, the adjustment as far to the left as possible. Similarly, I can control how much of the highlights that adjustment is being applied to. So I can say, okay, apply it to all the tones up to this brightness, but don't apply the adjustment to anything brighter than that. So that's essentially what that slider, or that those sliders on that gradient are doing in this bottom bar here. Of course, this kind of looks weird now. Your adjustment is applied down to that point, and then boom, it stops, or to that point, boom, it stops. So, the natural thing you're going to want to do is to feather that adjustment so it gradually excludes, the darker tones, or gradually excludes the lighter tones. You don't want a sharp, generally, there may be situations where you do, but generally you don't want that adjustment to stop and start abruptly. So how do we feather this out? Well, it's very simple. You'll notice that these sliders, they're kind of triangular shape, but they have a little white line, or in this case, a little sort of darkened line in the middle. These sliders actually come apart into two halves. So if I hold my Alt key or Option key on a Mac down, and then just pick the left part of the slider and move it to the left, notice that I have split that, formerly looked like a solid little triangle. I've split it into two. But also look what's happening in the image. It's now feathering that change out. So I can play with these two sliders, and I can really feather that adjustment out. So you can see that the darker parts of the gradient are getting darker, but it's probably hard to see in this example, but they're not going to complete black. I can do the same thing at the other end. I can hold Alt or Option down and click on the right part of that little slider and feather that out as well. So if I click OK, you can see now that, I turn it off and on. I've darkened my image, but I haven't let the darks go to complete black, and I've kind of protected, in this case, just a little bit of the highlights. They're not going as dark as they would otherwise if I hadn't protected them. So this is kind of like the luminance slider in the luminance range mask in Lightroom, where you can protect your highlights and or your shadows depending on what you're wanting to do. So if I turn on the next layer above, it was essentially a copy of the one below. Now you can see the effect. The top part is the effect where I've used the blend if. The bottom one doesn't have blend if applied. So you can see the difference here. Without blend if, the dark end of the gradient essentially goes to black, and certainly the lighter highlights are much more affected than in the top part, which is protected with the blend if. I've protected the highlights so they don't get quite as dark, and the shadows aren't going to black. So let's take a look at the kind of a real life example. And if I apply we'll use a curves adjustment layer to darken the image overall. I've darkened it quite a bit, and you'll notice that, understandably, the darker parts of the image get quite dark. Let's really darken it, and you can see that the darker parts of the image have almost gone to black. So if I double click on the layer to bring up that dialog box with my blend if sliders in it, and if I move the slider for the underlying layer, if I move the shadows into the slider, start moving that to the right, you'll start to see the darker parts of the image go a little bit wonky, if you want to call it that. The more I slide it, the more of the darker part of the image is adjusted or is affected. So if I move that slider to the part where just the darkest parts of the image are starting to look a little strange, I've now said, okay, I want that darkening from the curves layer to apply to anything except anything darker than this point. So these sort of grayish, wonky looking areas in the image aren't going to be affected by that curves adjustment layer. But of course, that looks wonky, looks a little weird, not something you would want to print and hang on your wall. So I'll use my Alt or Option key, hold it down, and then press on the left half of that slider and move it to the left to feather out that adjustment. So if I click OK, notice now that, yes, the image is getting darker overall, but the darkest parts of the image there's still detail in them. They're not going totally black or totally dark. So I've protected, the darkest shadows from being affected by that curves adjustment. Now, of course, because I've feathered that effect, um, you know, the darker shadows, some of them are going quite dark, and others aren't going quite as dark. But again, turning it off and on, you can see I've darkened the image overall, but protected those shadows. I'm just going to bring up that dialog box again by double clicking on the layer. And let's say I also want to protect some of the highlights from getting too dark. So I can move that highlight end of the slider down, or move the slider down until I get to the point where the highlights are clearly being impacted by that slider. I mean, they're going kind of weird looking. Alt Option key, split the slider apart, feather that out, and click OK. Now kind of watch the center area there as I turn the adjustment off and on. Overall the image is getting darker, but that fog in the center really isn't being affected that much. A little bit because of the feathering, but for the most part it's staying just as light as it was before. So that's how you can use BlendIf to control an adjustment, and that works with virtually any kind of adjustment layer. If I delete that layer and let's say use I'll use a color balance layer just for the sake of it. I'm going to really crank some of the colors here. Really give it a weird look. Bring up that dialog box by double clicking on the layer. And if I move the shadow end of the slider up, I'll move it up quite a bit, and then feather it out by using the Alt Option key. And you don't have to take that slider all the way to the edge. You can feather it as much as you want. You can play around with both sliders till you get kind of the degree and feathering amount that you want. And maybe I'll protect the highlights as well. So I'll move the slider down until the highlights are clearly affected, and then split the slider apart, feather it out, click OK. And you can see that the darkest parts of the image aren't really being affected by that adjustment, that weird color cast, nor are the brightest parts of the image. So I've protected both the highlights and the shadows. So here it is without protecting the highlights and shadows. It's being applied to everything. Now I've protected the highlights and shadows. So the BlendIf can really be used on pretty much any adjustment layer, and you control what it applies to in terms of the dark parts or protecting the highlights in your image. So I'll just delete that layer. The final thing I want to show you, again, is another sort of practical application. In some previous demonstrations, I've shown a freehand vignette. Normally, if you use kind of the built-in vignette tools in Lightroom or even in other software processing, post-processing software, it creates a vignette which is kind of around the edges of the image. So it may be an oval shape or a roughly square shape, but it it kind of just applies it to the outer parts of the image, which granted, is generally where you want the vignette to be applied. But if you want even more control over where your vignette is applied, then a freehand vignette is fairly easily accomplished. And this is something you don't need any special panel to do. And I'll talk in a moment about Tony Kuiper's panel has an action to do this for you, but you don't need any special. You can do it on your own. So I'm going to use the lasso tool up here at the top, the lasso tool, and start drawing, the outer boundary of where I want my vignette to be applied. And it can be, any shape you want. Wherever the cursor goes, that's, going to be selected. Of course, that's not what I want. I'll delete that and start again. So I'm going to draw I want a vignette that is in fairly tight to the main parts of or the subject matter of my image. So notice that, I've really customized my vignette. I'm not relying on a stock vignette, which is just going to apply to the outer parts of the image. I've created my own custom shape. But of course, right now, whatever I do is going to apply inside of this shape because, I've essentially created what will be a mask. The inside of this mask would be white, so any adjustment is going to be applied inside. That's not where I want to apply. I want to apply the adjustment outside. So I have to invert the mask so everything outside is going to be impacted. I can do that by using Shift Control I or Shift Command I on a Mac, or I can just go up to the Select tab, go down and click on Inverse. Now you can see the marching ants are around the outside and of course around the inside here. So this is the outside boundary, this is the inside boundary. My effect is going to be applied to the outer parts of this image. Now to apply that effect, I'm going to choose a curves adjustment layer. Notice as soon as I choose the curves adjustment layer, it automatically applies the mask. If we take a look at the mask itself, the dark area or the middle of the mask is dark, so the effect isn't going to be applied there. The effect is going to be applied outside where the mask is white. And if I now go to that curves adjustment layer, I'm not even going to move the curve. I'm just going to change it to multiply blend mode. So go down and pick multiply. And notice that just by changing the blend mode, it automatically darkened particularly the darker parts of the image. That's essentially what the multiply blend mode will do without getting into the specifics of the different blend modes. But notice that I've got a very hard edge, which obviously I don't want on my vignette. You don't want a vignette to be noticeable. You want it to be there to draw the viewer's eye into, the brighter part of the image, but you don't want it to be noticeable, which would look kind of weird, and this obviously looks weird. Well, I can fix that very easily. Make sure that I've got the mask selected here, the little boxes around the mask. Go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and pick a fairly high amount of blur. So if I turn the preview off and on, you can see that without the blur, that's the look. With the blur applied, you can't see that division anymore, that boundary. So it's a very nice blended mask. I'll just get that properties box out of the way. Okay, so there's my vignette at the moment, or as it stands at the moment. Turn it off and on. Obviously, there's a vignette around the outer parts of the image. The inner parts hasn't been affected, but that's certainly stronger than I want. I mean, that's still fairly obvious. It doesn't look natural. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to use the blend if slider, and I'll double click to open up that dialog box. And I'm going to protect the shadows. So I'll move it to where, whatever looks good to me, about there. Split the slider apart to feather it out using the Alt or Option key. And you can see that, the darker areas are still quite dark, but there's still some detail showing in them. I really haven't selected much in terms of highlights with my custom selection there, but I'm going to just make sure that any selection or any highlights I did select don't go too dark or get darkened very much. So I'm going to split that apart, feather it out, click OK, and now I've protected the darkest highlights, the darkest shadows, and any bright highlights that might be there. I've made sure that they still stay somewhat bright without getting darkened too much. But overall, it's still too dark. If I turn this off and on, there's still an obvious vignette being applied here. So the other thing I'm going to do is just reduce the opacity down 50%. That's maybe still a little bit too much. I can go wherever I want, whatever looks good to me. 37% is looking fairly good. Turn it off and on. There's obviously a vignette there, but it's now a pretty subtle vignette. So that's, again, another use of blend if, or practical use in terms of creating a nice vignette on your image. As I mentioned, those that have the Tony Kuiper panel, it does have a built-in action for doing this. I'll just turn that layer off. I'll go back, and with Tony Kuiper's panel, of course, you still have to define where you want the vignette to be. So I'm going to, again, make a customized shape for my vignette, and then click on the little TK button down here, which brings up his list of actions. And you'll notice one of them says freehand vignette. I'll click on that. And notice it brings up Gaussian blur. It's automatically set at an amount that it feels is probably correct. And usually it is. I usually just take the default amount there. Click OK. And there's my vignette. Notice it's automatically set to 50%. Turn it off and on. It's fairly subtle, but it's still noticeable. But notice that what he did was use a curves adjustment layer with the blend mode set to multiply. So essentially exactly the same thing that I did manually a few moments ago. I can still play around with this just to make it a little more subtle. I'll double click on the layer, bring up that dialog box. I'm going to protect the darkest shadows from getting too dark. So somewhere in there, feather it out. If I want, I can do the same thing with the highlights, although didn't really select any bright highlights within the vignetted area. Click OK. It's a little more subtle. In fact, or in terms of the darker parts of the image aren't going quite as dark, and there's still details showing. It's still a little bit, too much, so I can adjust the opacity, decrease it again a little bit more to whatever looks good to me in terms of being there, but still being pretty subtle. So, If you didn't know a vignette was applied, you may not realize it's there, but it is there, and it's, drawing your eye more towards the center of the image. So that's basically what I want to talk about in terms of the blend if slider, and of course the difference between opacity and flow. I'm going to stop the recording now and certainly be open to any questions anybody has on any of these or either of these topics I talked about today.